In the spring of 1856, a young boy was placed with the Finch family in a rural town in Kentucky. He arrived without a surname, didn't speak anything, and carried no belongings other than a folded envelope marked with one word: Finch. Over the following months he neither grew nor changed. His coat never wore down, his boots remained uncreased. The family chalkboard, used to measure children's heights each season, showed no movement in his mark. When photographed, his face appeared blurred or glitchy. In one image, he stood twice identical in stance, inches apart. Local records listed him as a temporary ward from Ash Hollow, yet the orphanage had burned 5 years prior. His name never appeared in the official placement rolls. Years later, a sealed intake ledger revealed a single blank line, no entry, no reassignment, just a faint annotation in red pencil: retained, unclassified. If no record placed him there, how did every record agree he belonged? And if he was never added to the system, why was he already being reassigned? Like the video if that question stayed with you. Subscribe for more sealed cases, and tell us where you are watching from. There was no rain that morning, just a low sky, and the smell of wood smoke carried east across the valley. The Finch family had cleared the porch of winter tarps and nailed down the loose boards days prior. They were expecting someone, or rather, something from the county. The boy arrived on foot beside the county clerk. Small frame, light coat, no suitcase. He held a folded envelope and looked at no one directly. Inside the envelope was a single sheet, unsigned, bearing only a brief instruction: Finch, Ash House transfer, April 6th. Mr. Finch asked the clerk where the boy came from. The man shrugged. Ash House registry shows him placed months ago, he said. But no signature, no pickup date, no initials. The Ash House orphanage, rebuilt in part after the fire a decade earlier, maintained exacting records. A burnt register corner, a smudged line. These were errors that earned formal reports. But this entry was something else. No initials, no date of birth. Just a line marked in red, the word Finch under it, and a column left blank where all other children had their admittance age. Inside the Finch home, the boy stood just beyond the threshold, his shoes barely muddy. He held his coat closed with one hand, though it wasn't fastened. Mrs. Finch offered him bread with plum spread, the same way she'd welcomed the last 3 children they'd briefly fostered. He took the bread, but didn't eat it. He sat at the table but didn't move until someone else did, not in mimicry exactly, but with a kind of delayed precision, like following steps rehearsed in silence. He did not speak that day, or the next. By the 3rd morning, he'd found the broom and swept the front room without instruction. He'd watched Mr. Finch oil the barn hinges and mimicked it with a dry brush, moving as if he understood purpose but not origin. When asked if he needed anything, water, shoes, more food, he nodded sometimes, but never reached for the things himself. Mrs. Finch tried to locate records beyond the orphanage. There was no mention of the boy in the church ledgers, no baptism, no school assignment. She sent a letter to the county records office requesting birth rolls between 1865 and 1870. Weeks passed, no reply. And still the boy remained, not disruptive, not disturbing, just misfit. Not in behavior, but in presence. The way he moved through the house without making sound. The way his eyes lingered not at people, but slightly past them. The other Finch children, 3 of their own and 1 long-term ward, took to calling him Caleb. And it stuck, though no one recalled who said it first. He never corrected it. One Sunday, Mr. Finch brought home a new family Bible to begin a fresh record of births, passings, and placements. He reached the children's section with pen in hand, but paused. Caleb had no last name, no date, no proof of when he had been born, or if he'd been born at all. That night, while stoking the fire, Mrs. Finch unfolded the envelope again. The paper had a faint imprint across the back, as if another letter had once rested against it. Under candlelight, she tilted the page just right. There, beneath the grain, faint and sideways, was a penciled word, almost rubbed out. Returned. By the second week, Caleb had taken to sitting at the far end of the dining table, the seat closest to the pantry door. He waited until everyone else was seated, until every hand had reached for bread or spooned from the shared bowl, and only then would he move. It wasn't unusual for foster children to be cautious, but caution fades, usually. Hesitation, once comfort settles in, gives way to curiosity or appetite. Caleb remained fixed in a quiet latency, always one movement behind. If Mr. Finch cut into ham, Caleb would wait, then mirror the gesture with exaggerated care. If Margaret folded her napkin, he would follow, but only after her hands were in her lap. At first, the younger children treated it like a game. They'd take turns sipping from their cups, tilting their heads, drumming fingers on the table to see if he'd match. He never did when they watched, only when they forgot him. It was Nora who noticed first. She'd glanced over just as she scratched her nose, a reflex, not a conscious act, and saw Caleb's hand raise and pause halfway, not quite mirroring, as if trying to recall the rest. One evening, while thunder rolled overhead and the candles guttered, Mrs. Finch asked him directly, "Do you want more?" gesturing to the bread. He looked to her, then to the bread, and nodded. Slowly. She pushed the plate toward him. He didn't move, not until Margaret, sitting 2 seats over, reached for her own piece. Then, without shifting his gaze, Caleb followed the motion precisely, his hand shadowing Margaret's in delayed succession. Later, Mr. Finch noted in his private ledger, "Child follows patterns, lags behind action, responsive, not initiatory." More curious were the moments when he didn't react at all. During a clap of sudden thunder one night, every person at the table flinched, save Caleb. He stared forward, unblinking, a fork half lifted. When asked if he'd heard the storm, he tilted his head, as if passing the question for instruction. They tested it, in small ways. The following Sunday, Mr. Finch deliberately dropped his spoon, letting it clatter to the floor. Caleb didn't mimic that, but when Eleanor dropped her own later, accidentally this time, he paused, reached for his, and let it fall. At no point did he laugh, or smile, or seem to notice he'd done anything strange. The mirror in the hallway, an old beveled glass passed down from Mrs. Finch's side, reflected the family as they passed on their way to supper or chores. But more than once, someone reported seeing Caleb flinch in its periphery, not at himself exactly, just before passing through the frame. Mrs. Finch tried to teach him embroidery, the way she had with her other wards. He copied the stitch, perfectly, but not when she demonstrated, only after she'd moved away from the hoop. The same stitch, in the same thread, in the same crooked angle. One night, while cleaning, Margaret found her sewing thimble missing. It reappeared the next morning, balanced upright on Caleb's plate before breakfast. No one said anything. He hadn't left the room. They adjusted, as people do. Children forget quickly, but adults remember in accumulation, the moments that build without name. Mrs. Finch began lighting the table candles earlier than usual, even in full sun. She said it helped her see the children better. What she didn't say was that Caleb always blinked half a second after the flame did. By late September, the mornings had cooled enough for frost to skim the troughs. The children had grown over the summer, proof visible in how sleeves tugged higher on their wrists and hems flirted with their knees. Mrs. Finch spent evenings by the hearth with a sewing needle, adjusting seams, letting fabric out where she could, and folding hand-me-downs into a basket for the next child who might fit them. The pantry door held years of small marks. Each child, at the end of a season, stood with heels flat against the doorframe, while Mr. Finch scratched a line and initialed beside it. Some children had outgrown the space entirely, their last mark nearly brushing the top lintel. Others still hovered midway, a timeline in chalk and pencil running up the frame like climbing vines. Caleb's mark was near the bottom, just above Nora's from 2 years ago. Faint, a line like any other. But it hadn't moved. Not by an inch. Not even a pencil smudge's worth of change. At first, no one remarked on it. After all, some children grew slower, and Caleb's frame was small to begin with, slight, narrow-shouldered. But when the others went to the door again at autumn's end, their lines all lifted. Margaret had gained 1.5 inches. Even Eleanor, who'd been sick in spring, had a small notch added. Caleb stood still, heels aligned, back straight. The chalk didn't rise. Mrs. Finch muttered something about poor diet. She added a second roll to his supper that night. He ate it without comment. A week later, Margaret found his shoes tucked beneath the bench where the children kept their pears. She lifted them, confused. The soles were clean. Not just clean, unused. The creases were still firm across the bridge, as if they'd just come from the cobbler, though Mrs. Finch distinctly remembered issuing them months prior. The same pair sat at Caleb's feet each morning just under the table, but never with scuffs, never with wear. On October the 12th, Mr. Finch made a note in the household book. Request winter boots for Margaret, Nora, Daniel. Caleb, no change in fit. In the barn, Daniel said Caleb still climbed the ladder to the hayloft with the same exact motion each time. Like he was counting steps, he whispered once while helping Mr. Finch lift feed, like he already knew how many boards. That same week, Mrs. Finch found herself unfolding old receipts, clothing orders, measurements scrawled beside names, and realized Caleb's entries had none. There was a notation, April, 1 set, assumed size, but no initials, no updates, no record of fit. The pantry door, a living document of their household, now held a gap, one mark that remained fixed while all others stretched. Mrs. Finch chalked a second line beside Caleb's on impulse, 1 inch higher. 3 weeks later, it hadn't been reached, not close. That second line was quietly wiped away one morning before breakfast, not by her, not by Mr. Finch. No child confessed. Caleb didn't acknowledge it. But later that day, when the children returned from the orchard, a third line had appeared, identical to the first, in the same chalk, beside the same name, as if nothing had ever changed. They stood against the orchard fence, faces tilted toward the midday sun, while the photographer arranged his tripod. The man was from Greensburg, traveling with a handcart and a leather-bound folio of previous works. He'd captured wedding portraits, steeple raisings, and even 2 county assemblies. He spoke with quick precision, asking each child to step left, then right, then still. It had been Mrs. Finch's idea to document the year's harvest with a family portrait. She'd written to the man in August, offering a warm meal and coin in exchange for 3 exposures. When he arrived, he remarked on the children's discipline. "Quietest lot I've seen," he said, adjusting the lens sleeve. "Except that one." He nodded toward Caleb, who hadn't blinked since they'd lined up. 3 exposures were taken. The plates were developed in his cart that afternoon. He declined to show them immediately, promising better prints once he returned to his studio. Still, he left a note in the Finch ledger that evening. "One subject developed irregular, will attempt enhancement." A week passed, then 2. The prints arrived in a stiff envelope tucked inside the mailbag from Greensburg. Mrs. Finch opened them by the hearth, smoothing each corner. At first glance, they looked as expected. The family in neat rows, expressions blank in the way long exposures often require. The orchard trees were behind them, the old fence post just off-center. Mr. Finch held Nora on his knee. Margaret clutched a sprig of goldenrod. But Caleb's face was wrong. Not absent, not quite. But the features were lost in motion, blurred as if smeared with the heel of a thumb. His outline was visible, his collar, boots and jacket, all clear, but his face remained indeterminate in all 3 frames. In the second image, he stood near Margaret's side. In the third, again, beside Daniel. But in the first print, he appeared twice. Once on the far left, next to Mr. Finch, and again at the edge of the group, behind the fence post. Both figures identical, same slouch in the shoulders, same turned-in toes, same collar buttoned too high. When Mr. Finch held the print near the lamp, he pressed a finger to one figure, then the other. "Double exposure," he muttered. But the photographer had taken care. Each SH. OT was a separate plate, no overlap, no reused film. The children were told not to speak of it. The prints were placed back in the envelope, then filed behind the ledger in the kitchen drawer. Mrs. Finch meant to write the man. She never did. Later that season, Eleanor, the youngest, was found tracing one of the photographs with a stick of wax from the hearth. She'd circled Caleb's feet, both sets, then drawn a faint line connecting them. When asked why, she said, "So he doesn't move again." The wax was wiped clean, but the marks remained faintly pressed in the paper. No other photographs were taken that year, and the photographer's name never appeared in the household records again. The camera, they'd all agreed, must have failed, but it failed in the same way, 3 times, and only for him. The photograph was never mentioned again, but after that day, Mrs. Finch began turning Caleb's face slightly before lighting any lantern. Not violently, just gently, a hand on the jaw, angled toward the shadow. And while the other children returned to school, Caleb stayed behind. Tasks were found for him, sorting dried beans, turning compost, folding kerchiefs already folded. Then, one afternoon, he was gone. It wasn't noticed until supper. His chair was empty, untouched. His plate had been set by Nora, same as always, but remained full. A search began with quiet urgency. Margaret ran the orchard line. Daniel checked the mill road. Mr. Finch took the trail west, toward the quarry bend. He found the boy standing alone just past dusk. Past the quarry and the woodcutter's fence, where the soil turns clay red and the tree line breaks, the remains of Ash House still sat, collapsed, scorched, almost reclaimed. The orphanage had burned in 1861. Everyone in Bartholomew County remembered that fire. A stovepipe collapse. 41 children. 1 overnight matron. No survivors. Caleb was standing on the edge of the site, toes nearly pressed to the ash. He didn't turn when Mr. Finch approached. He didn't startle. His hands were at his sides, empty, as if waiting to be given something. Mr. Finch stepped beside him. "You know this place?" No answer. "Did you come from here?" Caleb looked forward, and then, for the first time since he had arrived, he spoke. One word, quiet and certain. "Listening." Mr. Finch asked what he was listening to. There was no response. Only the wind across beams that had long since buckled, and the hum of the trees where fire had thinned them. Caleb did not blink, not even when the lantern was raised between them. It was unclear how long he had been there. His shoes were clean, no mud on the soles. His jacket was warm to the touch, as if he had not walked far at all. But the orchard was nearly a mile behind them, and dusk had fallen 2 hours before anyone noticed he'd gone. Mr. Finch walked him back in silence. At the gate, he asked again, "Listening to what?" Caleb said nothing. The next morning, the family ledger recorded the event in Mrs. Finch's hand. Child wandered toward Ash House. Located by father, spoke a word. A second note was added later, in a smaller script. First word, listening. That night, Mr. Finch went to the drawer where they kept Caleb's intake envelope. He ran his thumb along the edge. No contents inside, just the word, Finch, still written in red. On the opposite side of the envelope, something new, faint, pressed with what might have been the back of a nib, returned. No one remembered that marking. It hadn't been there before, or perhaps it had, and they hadn't looked close enough. Mrs. Finch asked that the envelope be placed in the family Bible. Mr. Finch agreed. But later that week, Margaret said she heard Caleb again. She passed his room while bringing linens to the washroom and paused. The door was ajar. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor facing the corner. He wasn't speaking. He was listening. And what unsettled her most wasn't the silence, but the faint tilt of his head, as if the souse and was coming from underneath the floor. The scarecrow had never worn a hat before. It was stitched together from last year's husk cloth, shoulders stuffed with willow branches, the frame fixed into the center of the lower field by Mr. Finch and Daniel in early spring. The crows didn't mind it much, but it was a marker, a boundary between the cultivated rows and the tilled edge where woods began. By mid-autumn, most of the harvest was already stored. But one morning before sunrise, Margaret noticed it from the kitchen window, a shape atop the scarecrow's head, stiff-brimmed, dark felt, sun-bleached at the crease. It was Emery's cap. Emery Dell had been hired by Mr. Finch in late August, a quiet man, barely 30, with a background in roadworks and seasonal harvesting. He slept in the small room off the tool shed, ate early, kept to himself, paid weekly in coin and tobacco. That same morning, his bed was found made, not freshly made, but untouched, sheets flat, quilt smoothed, his satchel and boots still placed beneath the cot. A book of Methodist sermons sat open on the sill, marked with a cut of twine. No one recalled seeing him after Sunday night supper. He hadn't collected wages. Nothing in his small quarters was missing. Nothing appeared moved. Not the mug by the basin, not the half-used bar of soap. Only the absence of the man himself and the presence of his cap. By the time Margaret saw it, Caleb was already in the field, shoeless, standing just below the fence post, eyes fixed on the figure at the center of the plot. Mrs. Finch later wrote, "The boy did not cry out or approach. He stood as if waiting for someone else to act. Daniel went down first. He called out. No movement. Caleb did not turn until Mr. Finch arrived and called his name. Even then it was slow, as if reluctant to break some unseen posture. Mr. Finch removed the cap from the scarecrow and brought it inside. He examined the stitching, the faded initials ED still intact on the inside band, a small tear at the crown, but nothing fresh, no signs of weathering or rot. The hat looked worn, but not abandoned. Later that evening, Margaret searched the barn loft for signs of Emery's passage. A few footprints in the dust, though none distinct. One bale of feed had been moved near the west wall. Behind it, tucked in the crease of the floorboards, she found Emery's notebook. Just 12 pages, most filled with field notes and verses. But on the final page, written diagonally and faintly, a single line. The boy knows when you leave. Mr. Finch didn't tell the rest of the household about the note. He burned it with the evening kindling. They did not report Emery's disappearance to the county. The scarecrow was dismantled a week later. But 2 mornings after that, Caleb was found in the same place. Not standing, but crouched low, arms wrapped around his knees, facing the same bare post. He didn't respond when asked why, only blinked. And for the first time since he'd come to them, he asked a question. What was his name again? No one had told him. The boy had asked a name that wasn't his to know. Mr. Finch hadn't answered. Not then. Not even later that night when Caleb stood silently by the stairwell, hands folded, eyes fixed toward the lower fields. Whatever he'd been waiting for didn't arrive. Or perhaps it already had. 2 days later, the letter came. Delivered with the morning post, in a satchel of tax notices and supply invoices. The envelope was pale and soft-edged, the kind of paper that yellows at the fold. No return name, just the Finch address written in a thin, tight hand. A hand not seen on any previous correspondence. The stamp was faded but intact. The postmark read, Calhoun Station. Daniel read it, first as he sorted the pile in the parlor. He assumed it was from a client or supplier. He opened it, expecting a shipping request or seasonal bill. It contained one sentence: "Do you still have the quiet one?" No sign-off, no date, no ink bleed or smudge, no identifying seal, just that single question, centered on the page, as if transcribed rather than written. He handed it to Mr. Finch without a word. Mr. Finch turned the envelope over in his hand. The glue seal had lifted easily. No tearing, no moisture stain, but it was the postmark that stopped him. He stepped into the front hall, where the wall calendar hung, and flipped back through the pages, checking for receipts and dates. Calhoun Station had not operated a functioning post office in over 7 years. The rail line had bypassed it entirely in 1864. The depot was sold for timber. The last known delivery route was decommissioned during the wartime reassignments. The building no longer stood. He set the letter aside and walked the perimeter of the house. The barn was undisturbed. The woods showed no recent tracks. The gate latch was still looped in its morning position, no signs of entry. Still, he kept the lamps lit that night. At breakfast the next morning, Caleb reached for the cup of tea before Margaret had poured it. Not out of routine, not out of error. He reached before she moved, as if anticipating the motion itself, as if already aware. Mr. Finch did not mention the letter to the rest of the household, but he did search the township records for any mail carrier with a route through Calhoun in the past decade. The last was a man named Reuben Glass, retired, moved west. Finch wrote him. The reply came 2 weeks later, in a shaky hand. "That line's been dead since the drought. Nothing moves through there but brush." That same week, Margaret found Caleb sitting in the pantry, staring at the drawer where they kept the sealing wax. He didn't move when the door opened. He only asked, "Where do letters go when the post burns down?" Mr. Finch retrieved the envelope from the drawer again that night. There were no fingerprints on it, none from Margaret, none from Daniel, not even his own. The parchment felt too dry, the fold too crisp, and something else. Beneath the outer flap, barely visible, a faint impression, as if pressed from the opposite side. As he turned it toward the lamp, the impression formed a single character, R. There was no one in the Finch family, nor in any registry nearby, with a name beginning in that letter connected to Caleb. And yet, when Finch glanced out the window that evening, Caleb stood in the dark, near the old delivery post, not facing it, facing away, toward the lane. Not waiting to receive anything, but as if he'd just sent something off. The letter was never found again, not in the drawer, not in the registry, not even in the burning pile Mr. Finch kept for scraps and worn-out feed slips, as if it had delivered itself and left the way it came. By the second week of March, the cold broke abruptly, not into spring warmth, but a damp chill that clung to the walls, the kind that softened wood and settled in bedding. It began near the quarry trail, they said, a cough among the Bristow children, then fatigue in the mill workers along the river bend. By the time the township physician charted it, Bartholomew County had 13 cases and a closure notice pinned to the schoolhouse door. The Finch household was among the quarantined. Margaret was the first to take to bed, flushed and irritable by noon, silent and fevered by dusk. The younger children followed in sequence, one waking chilled, another with pale gums, one with dried lips that cracked even as she slept. But Caleb never so much as sniffled. He wasn't spared in the way of someone blessed, only excluded, like a name left off a guest list. He ate little, slept less, and began a pattern that, at first, no one noticed. Each morning, a chair scraped softly across the flute. The boards, one of the wooden kitchen chairs, the kind Daniel had sanded himself, its left leg slightly shorter. Caleb dragged it from room to room, never entering, just stopping in each open doorway where a sick child lay, the chair placed gently at the threshold. He never sat in it. He simply stood beside it, hands behind his back, eyes fixed at the foot of each bed. He stayed for minutes, then moved on. Once, Mr. Finch timed him. 17 minutes outside Margaret's room, 14 outside Daniel's. No pattern by age or severity, just fixed intervals, slightly longer at dusk. When asked why he was doing it, Caleb didn't respond. Once Margaret whispered to her father in a half-delirious state, "He closes his eyes when we sleep." Finch checked this himself one evening, pretending to be asleep in the parlor cot. He cracked one eyelid and saw Caleb standing in the entry, chair placed behind him, eyes shut, breathing steady, hands clasped, as if waiting for something not to arrive. By the 5th day, the fever broke in all but Daniel. The boy remained too weak to rise. His breath came slow, in short pulses. The township doctor left another jar of mustard powder and suggested boiled vinegar compresses. That night, the sound came again, chair legs over wood. But in the morning, something changed. The chair had been moved farther than before, not just to Daniel's doorway but down the hall, past the pantry, aligned directly with the cellar door. Mr. Finch saw it just before dawn. Caleb was standing by it again, but this time he was not facing the bedchambers. He faced the cellar. His eyes were open, and he held something in his hands. A folded cloth, damp, yellowed, faintly steaming. Finch stepped closer. "What is that?" Caleb didn't answer. He walked back to the pantry, set the cloth on the lower shelf, and disappeared into the barn. Finch unfolded it. It was the vinegar, a compress, the one Daniel had needed, still warm, still soaked. But no one had placed it on Daniel's head. The boy's fever had broken sometime in the night, alone. The vinegar cloth had gone unused, and yet it had cooled in someone's hands. The vinegar cloth was folded back into the pantry drawer, never spoken of again. Daniel returned to chores within the week. No one mentioned the chair, or why it had ended up in front of a locked cellar door. The following Sunday, Reverend Halloway's sermon ended early on account of weather. Damp winds had swept through the valley, bending the stained glass windows inward until they shivered against the frame. The congregation was smaller than usual, but those who stayed behind gathered in the vestibule to collect the monthly bulletin, 4 pages printed in green ink, folded once, featuring a devotional, 3 announcements, and a woodcut on the back. The illustration was typical at first glance. A hand-drawn etching of a small rural orphanage, 2 chimneys, 5 windows. A line of children stood in front of the building, all facing forward, but one figure stood out, 4th from the left, head slightly lowered, arms behind the back. A boy in a worn double-breasted jacket, high collar, brass buttons, diagonal chest stitch, a jacket that looked exactly like the one hanging by the Finch hearth. Mrs. Finch noticed it first. She folded the bulletin and kept it in her apron pocket. That evening she laid it on the table beside the jacket. The buttons matched. 5 in front, 2 near the cuff, 1 missing on the left sleeve. Same fabric weight, same threading along the shoulder seam. She showed it to her husband. "This was published this week." He nodded. "It's not new," she said. "Look at the building." The shingles were wooden, not slate. The chimneys sat directly on the roofline, not inset. The door had no knob, only a ring pull. The schoolhouse had long since been renovated. They brought the bulletin to Reverend Halloway the next day. He flipped it over once, twice, then excused himself and returned with a bound book of previous sermon prints. "It's a reproduction," he said. "The image is from a much older pamphlet. We reprint when we're short on submissions." Mrs. Finch asked, "Who submitted it?" The Reverend hesitated. There was no name on the envelope, just the woodcut and a single sentence. They never moved the chimney back. Mr. Finch asked if he could keep the bulletin. The Reverend agreed, provided it was not circulated again. At home, Mr. Finch compared the bulletin woodcut to an almanac from 1831, one kept in the barn for seed forecasts. He found a nearly identical image on page 14 of the August issue. Children of the County West Orphans Annex, 1823. Same building, same line of children. But the boy in the jacket, Caleb, was not there. That figure, it seemed, had only appeared in the newer reproduction. Mr. Finch asked around. The original 1823 woodcut had no standing file. The bulletin's publisher kept no woodblocks or plates for such submissions. There was no record of the print's duplication. Later that week, Mrs. Finch found Caleb at the hearth, standing before the jacket. It had been taken off its peg and laid carefully across the back of the chair. She asked him gently, "Do you remember where you got this?" He shook his head, but she noticed the pause, the way he looked not at her, but at the folded bulletin still sitting, untouched, at the end of the table. The illustration now had a faint crease across the boy's face, as if folded there deliberately. The bulletin was never mentioned again. Mr. Finch placed it in a tin box with old tax stamps and receipts from the blacksmith. It stayed under the kitchen floorboard, beside the joist with the nail that never sat flush. Life, for a time, resumed. Then came Ruth, cousin to Mrs. Finch, married once, widowed early, childless. She arrived on the first Friday of November with a wool case, a shoulder shawl, and an opie, near and about everything. The visit had been promised for years but never made. "Now or never," she said. "I won't be carted around come spring." She brought candied oranges and a sewing thimble, and by supper she had reorganized the pantry labels by weight rather than content. She asked about the children one by one, until she reached Caleb. "I don't know this one," she said. Mrs. Finch smiled. "He's been with us since last April. You just missed him last time." Ruth set her fork down. "No, I was here late last spring. You had the cow with the bad hoof. I mended the parlor curtain with twine. He wasn't here." Mr. Finch said nothing. The children looked up from their plates. "He was quiet," Mrs. Finch offered. "Maybe you overlooked him." "I would have remembered," Ruth said. "That jacket alone." She meant the one Caleb still wore, the one from the bulletin. That evening Ruth retrieved her old travel diary, a habit she kept since her youth. She flipped through pages with lists, towns, dates, weather, rail fare. On the entry for May the 7th of the prior year, she'd written, "Visited Finch's, 3 boys, 2 girls, apple pie, storm near dusk. Caleb, not present." The last line was underlined. Mrs. Finch stood by the bookshelf and pulled out the family Bible. Inside the front cover, penned in faded ink, were birth dates and names of each child they'd raised or fostered. Caleb was not listed, not between Daniel and Nora, nor in the margin where they'd squeezed in Elsie's birthday after the ink ran, not even the nickname. "I thought we wrote him in," Mr. Finch said. They checked the guest ledger, the one they kept by the entryway for visitors, deliveries, and inspections. Caleb's name was not in it, not under April, not under May. Then came the cemetery plans, not because Caleb was gone, but because that's where the oldest papers were kept. Mr. Finch unrolled the long canvas scroll and followed the hand-drawn plots. Beside each family member's name was a tentative resting place, a habit started during the influenza years. There's Serene. It was no square reserved for Caleb. He was not forgotten. He was simply not recorded. Later that week, Ruth left early. She said it wasn't illness or offense, just a feeling I couldn't place. She declined the offer to be driven to the rail stop. As she walked down the lane, Caleb watched from the porch. He did not wave. The following Sunday, Mrs. Finch flipped through the family Bible again. This time, she noticed something odd. On the inside back cover, in the corner near the spine, someone had drawn a faint line with a pencil, just one line, at the same height as the others. No name, no date. She ran her thumb over it. The page felt smooth, no indentation, as if it had always been there, but never written by hand. The back page of the Bible was never spoken of. Mrs. Finch closed it softly, pressed it between hymnals, and slid it back into the shelf beside the cook's almanac. The faint pencil line remained, and no one touched it again. A week later, Mr. Finch took to repairing the attic floor. One of the slats near the chimney had warped from years of temperature shifts, enough to buckle under weight. The attic itself had been cleared just months earlier, swept clean for Ruth's stay. But beneath the lifted plank, hidden by soot and dust, he found a shallow cavity. Inside it, a tin box, scuffed at the corners, lid rusted. He did not call for help. The box contained paper files, curled at the edges, the topmost labeled in red wax pencil. Ash House Roster, 1839 intake. Not 1871, not 1856, 1839. The name Finch was written nowhere in the early pages, but the surname Calloway appeared twice, once under staff, once beside an infant's record. No name, no date of birth, just the note, left in spring, returned unscheduled. Mr. Finch turned the pages slowly. Most were ledgers and institutional memos, receipts for linens, requests for staff replacements, brief notes, marked reclaimed or transferred. In the middle of the stack were photographs, 5 in total, black and white, sepia-worn, taken years apart, different orphanages, different groups. But in each, a boy near the edge of the frame, never centered, never looking directly at the camera, same posture, same hairline, same sharp jaw, same worn wool jacket with the brass buttons too wide for the holes. He did not smile, not in any of them. The dates stamped on the backs ranged from 1842 to 1868. That night, Mr. Finch didn't tell his wife. He resealed the tin box, placed it inside a coal sack, and lowered it behind the tool shelf in the barn. He slept little. 2 days later, he rose early and rode into town to the Clerk's Hall. He requested access to the county archives under the pretense of verifying land boundaries. While there, he made inquiries, subtle ones, about Ash House, intake records, and photography archives. Most of the files had been transferred to state custody after the fire. What remained were duplicates, mostly handwritten, poorly organized, but one volume, bound in blue cloth and tagged Supplementals, Orphan Ledgers, 1830 to 1875, included annotations in a different hand. Not official, faded pencil. Next to 3 separate entries was the same marginal note, retained, not replaced. He copied the phrase into his palm with a stub of chalk. That evening, Caleb did not come down for supper. When Mr. Finch climbed the stairs, he found the boy sitting at the end of the hall, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on nothing. The door to the attic stood open behind him. He held nothing, said nothing. Later that week, a thunderstorm cracked the roofline and soaked part of the loft. While clearing the damp insulation, Mr. Finch found a second compartment, smaller than the first, empty except for one folded paper. A photograph, unlabeled. It was the family portrait taken the previous spring, the one with Caleb blurred. Only this version was clear, every face sharp, every edge crisp, every person exactly as remembered, except one. Caleb was not in it. The space where he'd been was not empty. It was filled, with furniture, with shadow, but not with him. The image had not been tampered with, no signs of removal, no markings, no tear, as if he'd never been there at all. The photograph was never mentioned again. Mrs. Finch stored it in a drawer beneath the hymnal pages and placed a quilt over the drawer key. Mr. Finch did not speak of what he found in the attic, and by early October, the coughing returned. The fever that followed took its time. Unlike the summer spell, this illness stayed low, not enough to panic the township, but steady enough to anchor him to bed by the window. He grew thin, tired, quiet. He passed during harvest week. No doctor was called. The undertaker came by wagon as arranged. The service was held at dusk, short and sparse. The local preacher, not the family's usual, read from Psalms. The Finch children stood in black coats borrowed from the neighbor's kin. Caleb wore the same jacket he had arrived in, still unpatched, still buttoned wrong. He did not cry. Later that evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. The meal had been set by Ruth, 4 settings, 2 stews warmed. No one spoke much. Mrs. Finch left her spoon in the bowl. The younger children took their servings and returned to their chores early. The house remained quiet, except for the occasional creak of roof timbers, cooling with the night. Then Caleb entered. Not from upstairs, not from the yard, just appeared from the hallway and walked into the room like it had always been his. He took the chair at the head of the table, the one Mr. Finch had always used, the one left vacant out of respect. No one stopped him. He sat, hands on the table, calm, no appetite, no prayer, no gesture to explain the choice. He did not serve himself. He sat through the entire meal in silence, watching the others. His gaze did not settle on anyone long, but moved around the table slowly, pausing not at faces, but at hands, at spoons raised, at knuckles resting, at the way Ruth's finger traced the rim of her glass. He observed as if cataloguing behavior, as if waiting for something to be done in the wrong order. When the plates were cleared, Caleb reached for the cloth napkin folded beside his setting. He unfolded it once, smoothed it, then folded it again, a slow, precise crease, before setting it gently atop the empty plate. The fold was too neat, too crisp, for something done casually. He rose and stepped away from the table, still barefoot, still without a sound. Mrs. Finch followed him with her eyes as he walked to the front door. It had not been opened since sundown. There was no light outside, and no lamp was lit in the foyer. Still, he opened the door and stepped out into the yard. The chill air pushed through the threshold, curling the flames in the dining candles. He didn't close the door behind him. The napkin remained where he had placed it. The crease held firm. No crumbs, no stains. The next morning, Ruth found his chair slightly turned, just a few degrees off from the night before. The silver fork at his setting was missing, but the plate remained untouched, its surface marked only by the faint print of the folded linen. In the days that followed, no one asked where Caleb slept. The room that had been made for him was in order, the blanket folded, the pillow fluffed, but no warmth beneath the sheets, no prints by the window, no dust disturbed on the sill. Still, each morning at breakfast, the 4th napkin was unfolded, and always, it was folded twice again before anyone could see him do it. The last time Ruth saw Caleb, he was standing in the orchard, facing the trunk of the oldest trees. It was late spring. She had gone to fetch eggs. When she returned with the basket, he was gone. That was 1897. 4 years later, across the state line, a ledger from a county-run poorhouse in Fulton County began receiving its annual preservation treatment. The clerk, tasked with re-inking smudged pages and cross-referencing census names, noticed a faint, repeated entry in the winter logbooks. Each notation was brief, not part of the meal records, not assigned to any resident. 1 extra plate remained scrubbed nightly, no visible recipient. The entry first appeared on January 2nd, 1901, and was repeated every 4th or 5th day until early March, always in the same handwriting, always signed with the initials EF. There was no known staff member with those initials. The handwriting was fragile, as if done with an old quill, but distinct, consistent across multiple entries. The pen pressure varied only once, on February 11th, when the ink ran heavier, and the line began to trail slightly off margin. The poorhouse had 16 residents that winter. Meals were served in shifts. The cook, an elderly widow named Clarabelle Mott, insisted on strict inventory, not for order, but out of fear of state inspection. She noted each portion, each refusal, each night's scrapings, and nowhere in her tallied accounts did an extra plate appear. Yet the scrubbed dish was always clean, placed at the end of the table, not stacked with the others, but set aside, cloth dried, edge damp. A surviving letter from one resident, held in the county archive, references this obliquely. In a note to her niece dated March 3rd, she writes, "Some nights, I think I hear them talking again, but I never catch a voice. Just the sound of the chair creaking softly, like it's being readjusted to fit someone who doesn't move much." No one else mentions the plate, not directly. The chair at the far end of the table was eventually removed. A visiting minister claimed the room felt drafted wrong. That phrase, underlined in his journal, was later quoted in a local Preservation Society report. The kitchen's washing basin was replaced in 1902, and with it, a new system of dishes and counting. No further entries from EF appear, but the original ledger, the one preserved from 1901, contains a single addendum on its back page, written in graphite, not ink. Faint, possibly added later. Plate number 17 should remain in rotation, not for use, but for balance. There is no signature, just a mark, a question mark beside the word Finch, and yet the plate itself, a plain ceramic with a chipped rim, is still housed in the Fulton County Historical Museum. It was mislabeled for years as orphanage serviceware, despite never being traced to an orphanage. It is displayed alone in a locked glass case. Visitors are not told why, only that the dish has always been part of the record. And each morning, before the museum opens, the cleaning staff says it's never in the same spot twice. The clerical office in Frankfurt rarely flagged anomalies. Most discrepancies in the state ward system were chalked up to lost ledgers, poor handwriting, or changes in census routes. But in late 1904, an assistant registrar named Harold Lawn began logging something harder to explain. Lawn had been assigned to cross-verify intake forms across orphan placements in 6 southern Kentucky counties, a routine audit prompted by a surplus in supply requests for winter coats. His job was to count heads, match names, and send corrections. Most errors were small, misspelled surnames, doubled initials, incomplete birth data. But on the 3rd week of review, he noticed a pattern. In a column labeled Initial Behavior Observations, several intake forms shared nearly identical phrasing, copied word for word it seemed. Quiet, cooperative, no speech, watches but does not react. That alone might have passed unnoticed, but the attached files, 23 in total, included hand-drawn likenesses of the boys upon admission. None had photographs. All bore pencil sketches done by attending physicians or matrons, and in every sketch, the subject appeared the same. Same eyes, same center-parted hair, same narrow chin, age listed between 8 and 10, estimated, no known birthdays. Lawn clipped the 23 cases and pinned them side by side across his review desk. He cross-referenced admission years. The entries spanned nearly 3 decades, from 1875 to 1903. None of the wards stayed longer than 6 months. Most were relocated. 4 were marked deceased, though no death certificates were attached. Each file originated from a different county. Each was processed by a different supervisor. No connections had ever been drawn between them, until Lawn. What unnerved him most wasn't the similarity, but the documentation trails. Of the 23 children, only 4 had clear transfer destinations. The rest had notes like placement uncertain, incomplete exit form, or presumed family claim. 2 had final pages that ended mid-sentence. Only 1 file had been redacted by the state. Its folder bore a yellow sticker marked, "Retained, do not circulate." Inside, most pages were missing, but taped to the inside flap was a single envelope. It contained a folded document stamped in blue ink. Unclassified, observation inconclusive, archive not authorized. There was no case number, just a handwritten name. Caleb F. Lawn wrote an internal summary memo dated November 18, 1904. It was 3 pages long. The last page concluded with, "I do not propose a supernatural explanation, nor do I intend to imply clerical misconduct, but the repetition, in name, posture, and outcome, defies standard filing logic. Either we have recorded the same child under multiple entries across counties, or we have failed to document something stranger than misplacement. The memo was returned with a note from his supervisor: drop, not flagged for re-review, archived to closed. The audit was finalized without correction. All duplicate entries were merged into their respective county totals. Lorne left the office 2 months later. His personal records list him as having moved west. A change of address notice filed in 1905 placed him in Nebraska, but no further documentation appears after that. Only one follow-up was ever attached to the flagged files, a single typewritten question inserted decades later, likely by an archivist during digitization. If he was never properly recorded, how was he placed at all? No answer appears beneath it, just a faint line drawn in pencil, a question mark inside the outline of a child's head. The fire at Ash House was recorded as accidental. Lightning strike, dry timbers, a missed chimney inspection perhaps. The coroner's log estimated the event occurred just past midnight on April 3, 1861. Of the children housed there, 41 were reported lost. 40 were named. The final line on the official register remains blank, not empty, blank. A smudge of ink stretches from the margin across the naming field, faded black, turning violet at the edges. It appears as though someone attempted to write, paused, and dragged the pen once horizontally. What followed was a blot, 2 slashes, and a curl that trails off the edge of the paper. The sheet had been dried, pressed, and filed, but that single line, decades later, still holds a dull shine in certain light. The ink there never set, never absorbed. Touching it leaves a mark. In 1889, a state inspector named Miriam Calloway reopened the Ash House files during a broader investigation into defunct orphanages. Her goal was modest: reconcile placement counts with county budgets. When she came to the list of the deceased, she noted a peculiar discrepancy. A Charcos L copy of the ledger, made in 1864 for record duplication, showed 41 names, including the last, Caleb Finch, with a birth estimate of 1855. But the original, kept under glass in the state archive, said nothing of the sort. The last line remained the same: smeared, dampened, never resolved. Calloway flagged the anomaly. She ordered a forensic tracing. The technician reported that the ink used for the charcoal copy was not the same as that on the original form. The hand was different too, slanted backward, uneven spacing, a mimicry, not a replication. There was no state employee by the name that signed the copied sheet, no record of Caleb Finch's death certificate, no enrollment papers from Ash House with that full name, only scattered references to CF and a single envelope retrieved during a desk clean-out, empty, unsealed, postmarked but unstamped. The fire itself was widely publicized at the time. Obituaries ran in the Bartholomew County Herald, names were listed in full, family sponsors made donations, but one photograph, printed weeks after the fire, shows the memorial plaque mounted in the town's North Cemetery. In the space between 2 names, Margaret Doyle and Samuel Keene, the stone is visibly scraped. Someone had chiseled a name, then removed it. In 1891, Calloway wrote a short note to her superior. Of the 41, I believe only 40 ever passed. The last was marked, but not counted, and the mark, it remains soft, as though it never had the chance to dry. The inspector's copy of that letter ends with a handwritten footnote. Retain the page under glass. It will not hold ink. She was reassigned later that year. In 1920, during building renovations, the original Ash House registry was moved into storage at the county archive. A clerk inspecting the condition of historical pages discovered something odd. In the box where the unnamed 41st line sat, the ink had bled. Not faded, not smeared anew, but expanded in all directions as if recently touched with water. The ink blots reached into margins that had previously been dry. The clerk filed a note in the preservation log. Recurred. The box was resealed. The page never dried. The final line of the Ash House deaths remains on file today, protected in humidity-controlled casing. Its label reads, "Unknown. Document retains moisture. Handling restricted." Beneath it in pencil, someone has written a name. It has been partially erased, unreadable now, but 2 letters are still faintly visible. CF. Nothing else appears, and nothing has stayed dry since. Not every child was lost. Some were simply placed where records don't reach. For more unearthed case files and historical anomalies, subscribe to Mr. Echoes. Some records weren't closed, they were just left waiting.